one part of that process left, and that's you've got all of your notes together. You know, Sunday's coming, or whenever it is you're teaching, you need to prepare your heart and mind to preach. Now, I'm going to just share with you what works for me. You're going to have to develop your own sort of process, but let me just walk through what works for me, just to give you the categories. First of all, if possible, most of your preparation should be complete before late Saturday night. Okay, don't push it to the last minute. If you do Saturday like I do, just make sure that you've done a lot of work prior to that, so that you're just refining, you're just strengthening, editing, etc. on Saturday. Saturday night, then, what I do later in the evening is I pray through the passage again. Just pray through it for my own soul and for the benefit of the people I'm going to be preaching to. Lord, open the minds of your people to understand your word. May they get this. May they understand this about you. May they see this about the gospel. Then mark your preaching notes. I used to mark them on Sunday morning, but that's a little bit challenging when your first service is at 8 a.m. So I now mark them on Sunday night. Just go through like we were just looking at those copies where I highlight, I change things, make an edit. If I find a mistype, I correct that. Whatever it is, I'm marking my preaching notes so they're ready for the next day. In that process, what I do is look up any references outside of the preaching passage to make sure I'm again familiar with them. So for example, I'm going to take somebody to 1 Peter. I'm preaching Romans. I'm going to take them to 1 Peter. I'm going to have them turn there. I want to have gone there in my preparation the night before. And I want to think through, what am I going to say? What's important to say about that text that relates to the preaching text? So I have in my mind, while it's not written out in my notes, I have in my mind the night before what is important to say about that passage when I have them turn there the next morning. And then prayer, and then this is not unimportant, get to bed. Get to bed. You need sleep for your mind to be functioning. You need a minimum amount of sleep, so make sure that you don't cheat that. Now, there may be rare exceptions. I remember one Saturday, I was in my office Saturday afternoon, about 4 o'clock, 4:30, preparing my notes. This is a couple years ago, 3 years ago now. And I got a phone call. Tom, you need to come to the hospital in Fort Worth. It was Charlie Yates, one of my elders, been in a plane crash. I get in my car, I go down to the airport, to the hospital. They had brought him from the airport where he was on takeoff. I won't go through all the story. Bottom line is, he died. I'm there comforting his wife, his kids, and it's late Saturday, Saturday evening, early Saturday evening, maybe 9 o'clock. I'm now traveling home thinking the message I have prepared all week will not work for tomorrow because one of the elders of our church just died. I need to comfort the flock. I need to speak to this issue. And so in that case, sleep goes out the window and you say, all right, let's start from scratch here. Now, I wasn't going to generate that entirely from scratch because I don't have time to do that. So now you're thinking, what have I done that I can make sure fits this occasion and adjusts? And that takes less time, but it still took me till, I don't remember, 1:30, 2 a.m. to be ready for the next morning. So that's going to happen, but don't let that be the normal practice. You need to get sleep to make sure you're fresh and ready to go the next day. Sunday morning, again, I'm not telling you to follow this pattern. I'm saying you need to include these things. Sunday morning for me is just prayer and meditation. I read back through my notes. I get up early. I'll go through my schedule shortly, but I get up early. I'm in my office. I'm reading, praying through my notes, just familiarizing myself again with the flow. I'm not doing any study at this point. I'm just familiarizing myself again with the flow of what I really want to say from that passage. The other thing I do on Sunday morning, it's not here in this, is is I think through, if I haven't already, what I want to do for the scripture reading and the pastoral prayer. Sometimes I write out my pastoral prayers. Other times I do them, just pray through the text that I've just read. It just varies. I don't do one thing all the time. But anyway, I want to make sure that I'm ready for everything that's on my plate that morning that I need to do. Just before preaching, okay, so we talked about Saturday night, we talked about Sunday morning, but just before preaching, I would encourage you to consider following some sort of pre-pulpit ritual. By that I don't mean like rosaries or something. I mean something that you do that reminds you of what you're really doing, why you're there. And for me, that's usually going to one of three texts in my mind, briefly. It's not like a long thing, but I just remind myself of 1 Peter 4:11. Let him who speaks, the one who has a speaking gift, let him speak as it were the utterances of God. Or I remind myself of 1 Corinthians 2, 1-5. And I pray, Lord, help me to speak today in the power and demonstration of the Spirit. And that's accurately reflecting the inspired word, the thoughts of God in the words of God. Or 1 Corinthians 12 that I began with on Monday, that God has sovereignly given me, the Spirit has sovereignly given me the gift I have, that Christ has sovereignly placed me in this context to do this for the benefit of His church, and that ultimately the Father will be responsible for the results of what happens from my ministry today. That's a favorite of mine. I prayed through that, you need to know, before I started this class with you men. I'm reminding myself that there are a lot of guys who could be here doing what I'm doing, who undoubtedly would do it better. But this is where Christ, for His purposes, has placed me for this time, and He will produce the outcome and result. The Father will, the results that He intends. And so that's a comfort to me. It reminds me that this isn't about me. This isn't about, whether I measure up or not. This is about the work of God. I then ask the Spirit's help in using my gift for the edification of His people, for clarity, quickness of mind, quickness of speech. Those are always my prayers. Help me to be clear, first and foremost, to be accurate, to be clear, and to be passionate about the truth. And then grant me the things that I think I need to do that, which is quickness of mind and quickness of speech. Don't let me stumble all over myself where I get in the way of the truth. And then the other thing I would encourage you to do before preaching, not only have that sort of just spiritual reminder. By the way, I'm talking like you're sitting on the front row, the final hymn is going on, or song or whatever, and you're just taking a moment to give yourself context. What am I doing? And to utter a prayer. I don't know if this is true or not, but the story goes that Spurgeon used to ascend into his pulpit, and with each step, he was reminding himself, I believe in the Spirit. I believe in the Spirit. That was his way of saying, this isn't about me. This is about the work of the Spirit through me in the lives of His people. So somehow, before you preach, you want to remind yourself of that and put this whole thing in context. And the other thing that I think is helpful, just very practically, if you're, let's start with your own church. Briefly remind yourself of what you intend to say in your initial greeting, or it's awkward. You get up there and it's like, okay, I have a message to preach, but I don't necessarily want to start on that line. What am I going to say? So think through, maybe whatever. Maybe it's unusual weather in your area. For example, recently we not only broke the drought, we crushed the drought in Texas, and the Lord did. And so one Sunday we just had like buckets of rain everywhere, and everybody's roofs were leaking, and so I didn't want to ignore that reality, so I stood up and commented on that briefly, just one line, 2 lines. But I had thought through that I wanted to do that because in the moment that may not come to you. So just briefly remind yourself of whatever it was you intended to do in terms of greeting, and remind yourself of where your introduction begins. So you don't finish that and go, okay, I have a sermon here, but I don't remember the first where I'm starting. So you know where you're going. I'll give you an example of that. When I preached at the Strange Fire Conference, it seemed awkward to me to be introduced and then to get up and just begin on my message. There needed to be some sort of greeting. Well, I had already rehearsed in my own mind what it was I was going to say, and I had in my mind the first few lines of my message so that it was there. I didn't have to stumble through that. That's what I'm talking about. Any questions about this part, preparing your heart and mind? Well, here's where we go now. In the overview of our class, give you the roadmap of where we've been. We finished now exposition, crafting an expository sermon. You have it. You're ready to preach. You're about to walk up to the pulpit. Let's move to delivery, preaching an expository sermon. In lectures on preaching, Philip Brooks defined preaching as the communication of divine truth through human personality. Martin Lloyd-Jones defined preaching as, quote, a proclamation of the truth of God as mediated through the preacher. So it is not simply about the truth, although it is primarily about the truth. There isn't obviously an element in which we are involved in the communication of that truth, and therefore how we do that matters. Both of these excellent definitions help shape for us several guiding principles of an effective delivery. So let's begin by looking at 4 primary principles of an effective delivery. The most important component in delivery is clarity. Clarity. Communicating the truth in a way that your people can understand it. Now, how do you accomplish that in your delivery? There are several tools. First of all, you need a single obvious theme that is stressed and repeated. That aids clarity. People know what your message is about. For example, 1 Corinthians 3, be careful how you build. Be careful how you build. Whatever your proposition is, you may say it a different way each time, but that theme comes out clearly as you work your way through the message. Romans 1, verses 18 to 23, the wrath of God is being revealed against those who deny his existence. You keep coming back to that theme. That aids clarity. Secondly, for clarity, you need a simple outline that clearly follows the passage. If your outline is easy to understand, it's out there, and it's flowing through the passage, then it aids clarity. They see it, just like you saw it when we were walking through Romans 1. You could see the outline. You could see how that was in the text. If your people see that, that aids clarity. My goal and your goal should be when our people leave the service that day, they may be saying, why didn't I see that before? But they're saying, well, that's obvious. That's clear. I see that. A third way that we accomplish clarity in our delivery is what we've talked about just recently, those brief transitional statements that review the previous major points and signal a change to the listener. And then the final element in clarity, I don't know why that's dropping off the bottom there, but the words that are clear and grammar that is easy to follow. In other words, you're not using $3 words when an educated 50-cent word will work. I'm not saying you dumb down the message. I'm just saying if your people are not familiar with the word pericope, use the word paragraph. Be clear in the language that you use. So all of those things aid clarity. And clarity is the most important component in delivery. That's the thing you want most of all. All right, that's obvious. Let's move to a second one maybe that isn't quite as obvious. A second primary principle of delivery is enlargement. The style of your communication in the pulpit should simply be an enlargement of your normal communication. In other words, it should be natural. But every component, such as volume, intensity, facial expressions, and gestures, must be enlarged so that the person on the back row gets the message. Let me illustrate it for you. This is really important for you to get, because I think this is one of the key things preachers miss in their delivery. Let's say I'm talking to Joey here. Forget the rest of you. It's just Joey and I. We're having a conversation. Here's how I would talk. So, Joey, what are you doing later today? You know,
Doing homework for this class.
doing homework for this class. Now, I'm mic'd so you can hear me, but if I were to turn the mic off, imagine volume, watch my gestures, watch my facial expressions. I'm talking to Joey. This is natural for me. This is how I would talk to an individual. But if I talk this way when I'm teaching this class, what happens to you in the back? You fall asleep. Because it's like I'm having a conversation with Joey and not with you. But when I come to speak, it's not that I become a different person. It's not that I take on a pulpit persona. No, it's that I enlarge everything that I do in my normal communication. I choose right here in my mind to make everything larger because I know that's important. For me, what helps is to think about the person on the back row getting that message the way Joey's getting it right here. When I'm talking to him more personally, to make sure the back row gets it, everything's got to get bigger. Let me illustrate for you. First of all, voice. I'm talking to Joey. I'm not going to blow him out with my voice. We're having a private conversation. But I want you to get that message. So my voice is going to get larger for you to get the same message that he's getting here on the front row. Let's take gestures. I'm talking to Joey, and my gestures they're my normal gestures. They're the gestures I always make. It's not like it's artificial. But if I'm talking here and I'm making gestures that size, the back row isn't getting it. So what I'm doing is I'm making my voice and my gestures larger. I'm choosing to use a little more energy to make sure they get the message he's getting here on the front row. And if they get it, he'll get it. You hear that in my voice? You hear that you see that in my gestures? Same thing with facial expressions. Again, I'm talking with Joey, and I'm concerned about what's happening later today, getting to my flight, and the same gestures. I'm really concerned about later today making it home when I need to make it home. My face is it's enlarged. My facial expressions are enlarged to get that message back there. This helps me a lot, guys. I hope you'll think about this. One way you can practice this very, very personally is put a recorder in the back of the room you're teaching in or the place you're preaching, and don't zoom it in. Keep it back with the same perspective that a person sitting on the back row would get. And then watch it and ask yourself, are they getting the message with the intensity I want them to get it? Now, the venue that you're in affects all of this, the enlargement. If I'm talking one-on-one, you saw that. If I'm teaching here in a room with 62 or whatever there is of us here in this room, it's a little larger. If I'm preaching in my church, which is an auditorium of about 500, 525, something like that, it's a little bigger because I'm getting to the back row. So now, I'll illustrate it for you. You've seen how I've been talking here. For my congregation, it gets even a little bigger. My volume, my gestures, my facial expressions, everything gets bigger. That's awkward here because we're not that big. But the larger the congregation, I'm trying to get it to the back row. Shepherd's Conference, preaching to an auditorium of 3,000, it gets even bigger because you've got to get that message all the way to the back row. You see the difference? It's not unnatural. It's not different than I normally am. It's the same me in private conversation. I'm just choosing by how I think about it to make sure I enlarge my voice, my gestures, my facial expressions, everything to get it back there. That's how you have to think about delivery. And as I told you, one of the best things you can do very practically is put a recorder on the back row of your auditorium or wherever you teach. Don't zoom it in. Keep it like the person seeing you and hearing you teach, and then watch it. I'm telling you, if you've never done that before, it'll be a revelation. I remember the first time I did that, I thought, how did those people stay awake? I can't stay awake watching myself. Questions about that? I really can't overstress this issue of delivery. This is what makes for an effective delivery. It's still you. It's bigger, intentionally bigger. Questions? John MacArthur writes this: speaking to a congregation from the pulpit should be no different than speaking with them individually in the pastor's office. He's making the point that it should be natural. It should be who you are. Broadus goes on to say, delivery should be the spontaneous product of the speaker's peculiar personality. I don't think he meant really peculiar in the way we normally use that word. Unique. As acted on by the subject, which now fills his mind and heart. So your own personality as acted upon by the subject which fills your heart and mind. Delivery does not consist merely or even chiefly in vocalization and gestures, but it implies that one is possessed with the subject, that he is completely in sympathy with the subject and fully alive to its importance, that he's not repeating remembered words, but setting free the thoughts shut up in his mind. Even acting is good only in proportion to the actor's identification with the person represented. He must really think and really feel what he is saying. The speaker is not undertaking to represent another person, to appropriate another's thoughts and feelings, but aims simply to be himself, to speak what his own mind has produced. Spurgeon says, let every man called of God to preach the word be as his Maker has fashioned him. The good and evil in men of eminence are both of them mischievous when they become objects of servile imitation. The good, when slavishly copied, is exaggerated into formality, and the evil becomes wholly intolerable. If each teacher of others went himself to the school of our one and only Master, 1,000 errors might be avoided. Don't imitate John MacArthur. Don't imitate whoever it is that you sort of set up there before you. Be who God made you. Just be larger in every way when you're teaching. Get it to the back row with the same energy and the same intensity that the guy on the front row is getting it. The third key principle of delivery is passion. If you want your congregation to believe your message, then you have to deliver it with passion. I had the opportunity to contribute to one of the chapters in the Rediscovering Expository Preaching book, and it was actually on delivery. And I quoted in there the story of G. Campbell Morgan was talking about the English actor McReady had with a well-known pastor. The pastor was trying to understand why crowds flocked to hear fictional plays, but few of them came to hear him preach God's changeless truth. McReady, the English actor, responded this way to the pastor. He said, it's quite simple. I present my fiction as though it were truth. You present your truth as though it were fiction. There you go. Passion. G. Campbell Morgan goes on to say, I cannot understand a man that is a preacher not being swept sometimes right out of himself by the fire and the force and the fervency of his work. That's passion. How can you be genuinely passionate? Passion is the natural result of being truly consumed with the truth you're preaching and a controlling desire to get that truth across to others. If you really are personally consumed with the truth, and if you really want others to get it like you've gotten it, you'll be passionate. So it starts, guys, guess where? Back in meditation, where the truth really becomes yours, where you own it, where it grips your soul. If the truth grips your soul, then you'll want it to grip the souls of others, and you will be passionate. Naturally so. Naturally so. Walt Kaiser writes, from the beginning of the sermon to its end, the all-engrossing force of the text and the God who speaks through that text must dominate our whole being. With the burning power of that truth on our heart and lips, every thought, emotion, and act of the will must be so captured by that truth that it springs forth with excitement, joy, sincerity, and the reality as an evident token that God's Spirit is in that word. Away with all the mediocre, lifeless, boring, and lackluster orations offered as pitiful substitutes for the powerful word of the living God. If that word from God does not thrill the preacher and fill him with an intense desire to glorify God and to do his will, how shall we ever expect it to have any greater effect on its hearers? Lloyd Jones says, preaching is theology coming through a man who is on fire. A true understanding and experience of the truth must lead to this. A true understanding and experience of the truth must lead to this. I say again that a man who can speak about these things dispassionately has no right whatsoever to be in a pulpit and should never be allowed to enter one. That's from Preachers and Preaching, or Preaching and Preachers. So, passionate. I mean, you know how to be passionate. Let's assume for a moment that you have had, at some point in the last month, a spirited discussion with your wife. You know how to be passionate. Let's imagine that you've stumbled on your next door neighbor's house. This happened to me once in Texas, and it's on fire. You know how to be passionate. Let's say, and I know this applies to all of us, or most of us anyway, let's say your favorite team is about to win the championship of whatever sport that is. You know how to be passionate. But it's natural because you're consumed with that. It matters to you. The same thing has to happen with the truth that we're preaching. A fourth primary principle of delivery is authority. Authority. A compelling messenger of the truth always speaks with authority. Our Lord spoke with authority, you remember? Not as the scribes, Matthew 7:29. Paul demands that Timothy and we speak with authority, Titus 2:15. Peter demands this of anyone who has a teaching gift, 1 Peter 4:11. Whoever teaches, let him teach as it were the utterances of God. So how do we do this? How in your delivery do you demonstrate authority? There are 4 tools that help us demonstrate authority. First of all, a godly character that complements our message. If your people know you to be real, they know that you have a passion for God and for the truth, that brings authority to what you say. You have credibility. Secondly, a message that clearly and obviously reflects the authorial intent and is delivered in the confidence that it reflects the authorial intent, that adds authority. Because it's not you, it's God speaking. All you're doing is being a mouthpiece for that truth. that brings authority to bear. And if you're confident of that, if you've done the work and you know this is what God is saying in this passage, it brings authority. Thirdly, a presentation of the truth that demands of the listener what the Scripture demands. This is where we get into it is appropriate at times to say, you, the second person, rather than the third person plural. You, second person plural, or you, second person singular, need to do this. Not because you have the authority to command, but because you've now interpreted that text accurately and God has the authority to command. And fourthly, the fourth tool for authority is the use of other supporting scriptural passages to illustrate and support the preaching text. That adds authority. When they can see not only is that what this text says, but wow, there are other passages that really weigh in on this issue as well and speak clearly to it. It brings the weight of the Scripture itself to bear on the people you're teaching. All of that brings authority. It's not something artificial. It's not, slamming the pulpit with your fist. It's not yelling at them. These things bring authority. Those are the four primary principles of delivery. Any questions about those? Clarity, enlargement, the idea of passion, and then authority. It's not about mechanics in the truest sense. There is some mechanic. We're going to talk about a couple of those just here in a minute. But mostly it's about those things. Okay. The types of delivery. The method, the methods of public address. I'm not saying these are all open to us as preachers, but the methods of public address are, number one, reading. That is reading from a manuscript. Secondly, recitation. That's reciting a memorized manuscript. Thirdly, extemporaneous. This is speaking from notes, a brief outline, or even without notes, but after thorough preparation. And then the fourth type of public address is impromptu. That's speaking without preparation. Obviously, as we've learned this week, that is inappropriate for preachers. Not to say there might not be an occasion at some point in your ministry when you're forced to preach something that's already been studied and is a part of you, sort of on the spur of the moment, but that should not be the normal practice of your life and ministry. Obviously, here in these four types of public address, the one that's appropriate for us as preachers is the extemporaneous. We've done the thorough work, we've done the preparation, and we take some form of notes with us from which we speak. John Broadus, by the way, has a lengthy portion on the preparation and delivery of sermons on this issue. I'm not going to go through that. I have it in my notes here, but I don't think it's beneficial. We'll keep moving. So the specific components of delivery. Let me just illustrate the mechanics a little bit as I go through these. First of all, voice. When it comes to your voice, you want variety in pitch, volume, and intensity. Variety is the key word. Let's see if I don't have a great ear, so forgive me if I don't do these perfectly, but let me illustrate each of those for you. First of all, pitch. That has to do with the sort of note your voice is hitting. So if you're always talking like this and there's no variety there. Or you're always, it sounds artificial. You sound like a radio announcer's convention, There needs to be variety. Sometimes you will get higher, and other times you'll get lower to make a point. Variety in pitch is important. Volume, the same way. And I grew up in Southern Baptist settings where sort of the Southern Baptist shtick in the South where I grew up was you get to one volume pretty quickly and you stay there the whole time, and that's just short of yelling, if not yelling. That'll wear you out. I mean, how many of us, I won't ask you to raise your hands, but how many of us would want to sit under someone doing that week after week to hear the Word of God taught? Probably not many of us. Why? Because we all enjoy variety. It's not to say there's anything wrong with a guy getting loud when he wants to make a point. But then bring it back. Bring the volume back to more normal. And sometimes the bigger impact can be made by even bringing the volume down and making it soft, but still where they get it on the back row. Variety in volume. In fact, I think one of the most memorable sermons people tell me that I ever preached at Grace Church was when John was away one Sunday. I was asked to preach the evening service, and I was preaching on Providence. And that Sunday afternoon, I lost my voice. I mean, lost it. So I preached Sunday evening church at Grace Church with a mic, but at a whisper where I barely had a voice at all. And I think people had to strain to listen, and they got more out of it. Volume, variety and volume. Same thing with intensity, and I've already illustrated that. Just there's a difference between a normal intensity where you're speaking like you do normally, and then you get intense to make a point. Variety. Don't do any of those consistently the same way through your entire message, or you will wear your listeners out. You want to aim for variety with your voice. Gestures. They should be, as I've already noted, natural and enlarged. Don't do if that's not what you ordinarily do, don't do that. That's artificial. Whatever. Make your gestures who you are. When you're speaking, just make them a little bigger to get to the back row, but don't make them artificial. Natural and enlarged. Eye contact. There's a little bit of disagreement on this, but it is very awkward to try to make eye contact with everybody in your audience. If you do that, for most of us, that will distract you from your message. What I do, and it's what you'll even read this in Rediscovering Expository Preaching, is you choose some points of focus throughout. You try to spread around. You don't get to everybody. You've probably noticed that. Maybe I haven't made eye contact with you much during this class, but I'm trying to spread out that point of focus so that hopefully you don't feel left out. Because if I try to go through each person, I'm distracted now from what I'm saying. So the eye contact should be balanced and sort of spread around the congregation. I have my auditorium, a lot like Grace, runs from sort of all the degrees around to my sides. So I want to go everywhere from here to here to here to here to here. In the process of my message, not necessarily I always go that order, but as I'm preaching, I want to try to hit each section of that, and I usually end up with a person that my eye ends up falling on in each of those sections, or a couple of people as I'm sort of spreading around. So your eye contact is just a balanced view of the audience, but don't try to see everybody and sort of stare into their souls. Appearance. Clean, that goes without saying, but it doesn't go without saying. Clean, make sure your clothes are clean. There are no obvious, food stains. There's, that your clothes have been laundered. They're appropriate. By the way, let me just say, guys, this will limit your ministry because the people who care about these things are not going to keep coming if you don't present yourself well, because they don't have respect for you, because they see that as part of self-care and self-discipline. So it will limit your ministry. Appropriate. There's a lot of debate about this. I would just say this, guys. Watch ESPN. The sportscasters on ESPN, for the most part, believe they're doing something important enough that they wear suits. In our culture, obviously, that still means something. So you can try to argue around that all you want. That's just the reality. Our president, most times when he's doing something, he's in a suit. Our congressman, etc. Why? Because in our culture, it says this is important, this is serious. So I would encourage you to move in that direction as opposed to, the skull and crossbones black T-shirt with the jeans and the Keds or whatever it is. I know that's outdated, but it's coming back because my daughters want them. Undistracting. And by the way, maybe you do different in different places. If I go preach in Florida, and I've done that, and they're really casual, then I don't wear, in Dallas, I wear a suit. I mean, a sure enough suit. No sport coats on Sunday morning, a suit with a white shirt, a tie, even a pocket square. That's more appropriate to where I serve and minister. If I ministered in Florida, that might be overkill because nobody's coming in that. But I don't want to be pulling down the dress. I want to be above the middle of the road. So, if they're all dressing casually, then I wear a sport coat and a tie. Or if they're all dressing, a little less formally, then I wear a sport coat like I'm doing now. Part of leadership, forget pastor, part of leadership is saying I'm going to be at or above the middle in terms of clothing. And you'll notice that in any field. I don't care what the field is. Shine your shoes. My dad beat it into my head. You're not dressed until your shoes are shined. And people notice. I'm telling you, they notice. Iron your shirt, button your jacket. Don't do this the whole sermon, because they don't want to see your little roll. Button your jacket. That's what. If you're going to wear a jacket, that's what you're supposed to do. Audience participation, that varies by venue. The larger the crowd, the less you can have them participate, the less you can interact. Here, we've done some of that, but frankly, even with 62 guys, it's not the same as if I was teaching a Bible study, where I'm going to have a lot more, back and forth, and I'm going to be getting your involvement and drawing you out. So it varies by venue and by the size of the crowd. You just have to play that by ear, and that to some extent comes naturally. A few miscellaneous details about delivery. Take care of your voice. Many guys have a problem with this. Avoid dairy before you preach. Don't drink a big glass of milk before you preach. It can coat your vocal cords, make it very hard to have the energy that you need and the musculature to deliver. Avoid straining your voice before you preach. My brother, I'm the last of 10 kids. They're 5 boys, 5 girls. We're all big, I'm sorry if you're on the other side of this, but we're all big Alabama fans. And so last couple of years, Alabama has started its season at Cowboy Stadium. And a couple of my brothers and a couple of my nephews have come out. We've gone to the game Saturday night. Well, I'm a big fan, but I'm preaching the next morning, and that's more important than being a big fan. So I'm there, I'm engaged, I'm excited, but I'm not yelling. I'm not straining my voice because I won't have a voice to preach the next morning, and that's far more important. So don't strain your voice. Get a good night's sleep. Wash your hands often, particularly during the winter if you want to avoid getting sick. I stand at the back after every service, and I'm back there, greeting people and answering questions, shaking hands, and I can't tell you how often someone will shake my hand or give me a hug and then say, "It's so good, Pastor, to be here. I spent all night last night hanging over the toilet, sick as a dog, but it's so good to be in church this morning." You're like, thanks for sharing. And so I don't put my hands anywhere near my face or anywhere until I have a chance to get to the bathroom and wash my hands. Just wash your hands a lot, okay? I don't want that to get in the way of my greeting God's people, loving them, letting them know my care for them. So I don't want to no, just be natural, shake their hand, move on, and then as soon as you have a chance, go wash your hands with soap and water. Or you'll spend all winter sick. Identify your verbal bridges and eradicate them. Always be listening to yourself. I did that yesterday and today, and I realized when I ended yesterday, when this is transcribed, and it's going to be hopefully transcribed because it's going to go in a book, I promise you, For the first time in the week yesterday, I said okay way too often. And I did a little bit this morning, but I caught it and I began to cut it out. You have to always be listening for those verbal bridges that are just filler. They don't do anything. They're like or Be listening for those verbal bridges and cut them out. It happens to all of us. I was telling some of the guys when I was, there you go, did you hear that? When I was in John MacArthur's office getting those cards that come in every Sunday, one day on Monday morning, I got a card from some well-intentioned church member. On the front of that card were tick marks. You know, the ones where you have the 1, 2, 3, 4 cross, or it goes the other way actually, that way. 1, 2, 3, 4 cross, 1, 2, 3, 4 cross. The card was like filled with these marks. I thought, what is this? And I flipped it over, and on the back side it said, Pastor, just thought you'd want to know how often you said this morning. We all do it. Even the best preacher in the world does that. But we want to always be looking for that and cutting that out of our speech as much as possible, those verbal bridges. Be careful with humor. I've already mentioned that. Preferably use humor from life, not jokes. Never use humor at the expense of your wife or your children or your family or friends. You are always the safest target for humor. Make yourself the brunt of the joke. Better to use too little humor than too much. I literally was at a wedding. I won't tell you where. I was at a wedding, and the pastor, who's a good guy, an evangelical guy, a brother in Christ who believes a lot of what we believe, told joke after joke after joke at the wedding. It got to be a joke. One other thing about delivery, sort of related to delivery, never turn down a breath mint when it's offered to you. Somebody says, Pastor, you want a breath mint? Say, yes, I'd love to have one. Also, if you're married, ask your wife, do I struggle regularly with bad breath? If you do, never be without a breath mint. Always have them with you. Always carry them on your person. Take one after you get down from preaching, because that's one of those times you're likely to have it.